hello, everyone, and welcome back to Cyrus Webb Presents. I'm your host, Cyrus Webb. Glad you all could join us once again. Whether you're new to us on the Amazon platform, we welcome you. Glad you all could be with us. Make sure if you have not done so already, you guys, if you're on the Amazon side, make sure you hit that follow button. You'll see it either here in this corner or you'll see it down below. You also will see the books by our next guest. I'm so excited to welcome back Francine Falk-Allen to our broadcast today. I've interviewed her on the platform for her other titles. She has a brand new book that's here now with me in Kentucky called A Wolf in the Family. We're going to talk to Francine not only about the writing of this book. It's a little bit different than what we've talked about before. We've talked about her own journey in nonfiction books before. Now she's given us a historical fiction book to be able to enjoy. We'll talk about what it was like for her to look at her family, to look at, of course, what she was able to learn, not only, of course, from their resilience, but also, of course, from the challenges as well. If you guys are just now finding out about the book, we will remind you can be able to get your copy here on Amazon and stay connected with Francine. Francine, great to see you again. Thanks for stopping by.
You too, Cyrus. I'm glad we get to talk again.
Definitely great. Salute to you, Susan. Good to be able to see you over there on Instagram. Glad you could join us too. So, Francine, I was just telling you before we went live here how much I love this book. And I loved it because I love the fact that, as unfortunately, even though you take us back to the 1930s and a time that many of us may not know from actually living in, a lot of the things that your family went through are things that we can relate to. So what has it been like for you to have people make that connection with your family that you're able to share in the book?
Well, I hope that people will see that we have a long way to go yet for women and that we're better off than we were 100 years ago, for one thing. And that, well, I mean, I'm sorry to say that my family had some problems, and you will read about them. And I hope that you'll be somewhat entertained by them. But these things are things we still grapple with. The family issues are still things that we grapple with. So I think that a lot of people will be able to identify with it, even though it's not their own family. I hope that answers your question.
It does. And that's exactly what I meant. And that's what I think. Well, I know it will happen because that's what happened for me as well when I read the book. Francine, I was so glad when the book was pitched to me. For one, of course, because I've had you on the show before, so I was excited to talk with you again. But I think, too, I was curious, and now I even said to you before we went live here, I better understand your own resilience and your own grit. I want to say for those who are joining us on the Amazon side, you will see some other titles by Francine there. I'm going to highlight another poster child that a lot of us have gotten to read and gotten to know about you, Francine, there. I'm going to highlight it for those there. Also, No Spring Chicken. That was, I think, the last time that we had you on the broadcast. What made you say, Francine, after writing those nonfiction works, that you wanted to take us back and let us know more about your family?
I was at a memorial service in about 20 years ago for one of my many uncles. My mother had been deceased for a long time at that point. And I'm sitting across from an aunt, and in the middle of the conversation, she mentioned something. Well, when we were in the orphanage, and I said, wait a minute, Aunt Dorothy, what are you talking about? So she told me part of the story about why the youngest children were there. And I thought, okay, this is an amazing story that my mother never told me. I think she was ashamed. And so I thought, I'm going to collect more information. I did from other aunts and uncles and cousins, although not very much, to tell you the truth, because a lot of people didn't know about all of this stuff. Some did. And I followed up on why my 5 youngest aunts and uncles were in an orphanage for a time, for about a year, I think. And I just thought, okay, I can't write this as fully factual because I don't know everything that happened. I don't know the details about what led up to this situation, but it's such a good story. I could make something up. So I decided to try, making it into a fiction. And I looked up as much information as I could to make it as factual as I could, but made up all the conversations, the situations, the way people met, who they knew, all of that sort of thing.
Yeah. I thought when you were just talking, I thought about one conversation that was in the book. I wanted to go back and look at it again because one of the children, even later on in conversation, as they're talking to someone that they've gotten close to, and basically explaining what had happened about them being taken away, basically from their mother, and her what she had to say was, it just wasn't fair. It wasn't right. But it happened because, of course, the times. But I think that's one of those instances in the book, Francine, that we think about happens today, unfortunately, right? That you
Hmm.
have situations, unfortunately, where, without the say of the other, the other parent, decisions are made, right? That may not be in the best interest of the child. What was that like for you to think of that? I mean, we've all heard that saying, Francine, the more things change, the more they stay the same. What was it like for you to think about that with your own family?
Well, I think, it was so long in the past
Mhm.
that I thought, well, this must have affected these children in some way. And I think, not knowing my grandmother who died when I was 2,
Mhm.
and I did know my grandfather, and he was very tight-lipped. So there was, since I didn't know about it before he died, I couldn't ask him. But projecting what I think may have happened, I think the children that were in the orphanage did resent their father. And he was the grandfather I knew. And I found him to be cool. And I think he was not only cool, but I suspect he may have been cruel.
Mhm.
And my mother inherited some of his tendencies. So I knew, in talking to her sisters, they said, yes, she was more like her dad than her mother. So I projected that my grandmother must have been a nicer person, and that's how I made her up in the story. And I don't know that for sure. Maybe she
Yeah.
was not as nice as I made her.
Yeah.
But I mean, I had to go back and say, I know what my mother was like, and
Mhm.
some of the stories she told me. So that tells me something about what their life was like and what the family was like. And so I kind of had to project that. I didn't know my aunts and uncles really well. I knew most of them. I had met most of them and spent some time with some of them. So I did know what some of their personalities were like. But having not known until I was in my 40s about what they'd been through as children, I mean, at least this part of it, it was just stunning to me. So I just hope that I was respectful and that I treated it in a way that, if not completely factual, is somewhat truthful.
Yeah, I love that. And I want to say too about the book. The other thing that I really enjoyed, Brendan, is that we are able to see your own creativity. As I mentioned, up until this point, I've only read nonfiction by you, right? So it was great to kind of see you have those licenses to be able to play with the characters as well. But with that being said, again, there are so many things that come through. I mean, prejudice and bigotry come through in this book. There's a really interesting exchange about, whether you call yourself this or that, how we see you, it doesn't matter. But and there are some people who feel that way. I run into a lot of people who feel that way. There's some people who don't feel that that way. You are judged as an other. What was that like for you to address in the book? Because that is an important part of the story too. What was that like for you to address?
I don't know if you remember, Cyrus. I wouldn't expect you to, but one of the reasons I had left the Mormon Church in 1967 was because Black people couldn't hold the priesthood, and I just couldn't get past that.
Mhm.
And so I knew that my mother was prejudiced.
Mhm.
And when I was thinking about this morning, actually, when I was about 11 or 12, she said to me that my step grandfather, my grandmother's second husband, was an Indian, like that. And I
Mhm.
remember thinking at the time, why would you say it like that? Why does that matter? And I was raised in a town where there was a lot of prejudice, and I can't say that I was like above it all. I wasn't. I
Mhm.
didn't really understand about race relations and all that until I was in my 20s and went away to college, and it all
Mhm.
became clear to me, which was
Sure.
part of why I left the church. They have changed their philosophy now, which is good for them, but it was too late for me. So I just thought, gosh, my step grandfather was probably Native American, and what a blessing to have in our family, not something to be ashamed of, and so. And I also found out that my step grandmother that I knew, who was married to my actual grandfather, was prejudiced. And I hadn't known that at the time, but it didn't surprise me a lot. Mm-hmm. And so, I came from that, but I turned away from it. And it's hard for me to understand how they could substantiate that. They even had it tied up with their religion that God didn't want people of color and white people to mix. They could be friends, but that's all. And it's just so complicated and unloving. So that was I felt I really had to address it in the book because I knew that it was a big part of the way my aunts and uncles were raised.
Right. And I think that is, and I appreciate you sharing that, Francine. I think that's another way when I was reading the book, and that's why I alluded to that scene to go along with what you just said about, when someone, calls himself, addressing themselves as white when they may have been half Indian, and them being told it doesn't matter. But for some people it does, and that idea of identity means so much, and how they're perceived and also how they see themselves. So I wanted to ask you that part because I was curious, and you and I have not discussed this. Did thinking about finding out these things about your family, did it make you look at yourself differently?
Not so much in this book and in this time. Mm-hmm. I'll reveal something that is not in this book that isn't about this side of the family. My dad's family, way, way back, were slaveholders. And when I learned that, I broke down. It was just so hurtful to me, and I felt so bad about it. I felt like helpless to do anything about it, and I was talking to a historian at the time, and she said, well, it was part of the time, and a lot of people just hadn't realized yet that it was the wrong thing. Yeah. I did find out that my third great grandmother, who was the one who had inherited slaves after the Civil War, made sure that all of them became property owners with deeds to their properties so that they could prove they actually owned it, that they owned their own homes. And that was a little bit of a salve on it, but it still was like, who knows, what would have happened. That was much more upsetting than getting into this book. This book was, I already knew that there was prejudice on that side. And so I just needed to bring it out because it was true,
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you sharing that too. And I think as we look at our own families, I was saying to someone just yesterday here that I think there's a lot of things maybe in all of our lives, our families' lives, that, are not what we would want on the front page of the paper, But I think the fact that, as you just alluded to, that individuals, were able to do their part to try to right wrongs, and how you've chosen to live your life. I think that's the lesson for all of us, that it really becomes a choice as to what we choose to do. So I wanted to ask you this question too, because as I mentioned, we've gotten to know you through your previous work. Why did you feel like now was the time to tell this story?
Because I had time to write it. That's really,
okay.
It really was it. I had finished my second book, and it was out there, and I was, you have to keep marketing your books. I do advertising, and I take the opportunity to do talks when I'm asked, particularly about polio and disability.
Sure.
But I had the time, and that was part of it. I had been collecting information for 20 years. I had written an essay, about a 9-page essay about all the facts that I knew about my grandfather and my mother's family of origin. And I just decided this was the time to do it. Also, I'm going to be 77 in December. Wow. And I didn't want to be 80 and publishing a new book.
Oh, boy. My mother turned 77 this year. Hello to you, Tanya, joining us over there on IG. Appreciate it. Let me reset real quick and say, for those who are just tuning in, I see you guys coming in on Amazon as well. Welcome. You're watching Cyrus Webb Presents here on Amazon Live, but we are simulcasting on Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, X, and on Instagram. I'm speaking today with an author I've had the privilege of speaking with on the radio side, but also here on Amazon. That is Francine Falk-Allen. She's celebrating her newest book, A Wolf in the Family. It's out now. I'm going to highlight it again for you guys on the Amazon side, so you can be able to get it for yourself. But I also recommend you checking out her other books as well. Not a Poster Child, which was part of my introduction to Francine's story, and then No Spring Chicken as well. And Francine, let's talk about you for a moment, because I do like the fact that you have put yourself literally at their front and center, talking about things that are not always easy to talk about, but also letting people know that just because, you may be getting older, just because you may be dealing with a disability, does not mean there are things that you can't do. I mean, you still enjoy doing a lot of things. Well, I know the last time we talked, I think you were still hiking at that point. If I remember correctly, I may need to go back and watch it. I think you may have just had surgery, I think, after the last time that we'd spoken. But what has it been like for you to kind of use your life to show that life continues, and it really is what you make of it?
Well, I keep saying, well, sorry about that.
No, you're fine.
My philosophy really has a lot to do with, I always say you have to keep looking out the window. And that's partly because I love the outdoors, and it's an easy thing to do that makes me feel better when I don't feel so great. But I mean it philosophically as well, that it's really important to keep looking for the next thing. I was telling someone today that when I got to the point where I couldn't walk as far anymore because one of my legs is mostly paralyzed, I got a scooter so that I can go around the neighborhood, and we take it when we travel. We just went to Ireland and England and had a great time, except we had a little trouble with Aer Lingus. They wouldn't let me on the plane with the scooter, but we just had a lovely time, and I can go places. So that was an adaptation that was really worth it. I used to think, oh, people who use scooters, they're just lazy, and what a thing to think when I had a disability myself. But I got one, and I'm really glad for it because it's opened up my life. And after I sold my accounting practice, I started writing books. There's always something new to discover. I think if you can't do things that you physically could do before, you find something new. And thank God we now have podcasts, and there is a lot of media that's available if you can't get out of the house. Right. And if you think you can't get out of the house, I feel that a lot of people probably could if they were willing to use canes or assistive devices of other types.
Mm-hmm. And I tell you, it's not easy. It took this year for me to finally get my mother to use a scooter and a walker. She refused it, but she said, no, I don't want to be, I don't want to do this, and she was singing all this. And finally this year, she got to a place where she had to do it. And she now you can't stop her.
Yeah,
So
right.
But her fear was, because I asked her, I said, well, why did you resist it? She said, to me, that was another sign that I was getting old.
Yeah, that's right. A lot of people feel that it makes them look old. And I finally thought, I am old. I deserve to have things be a little easier. When you get into your late 60s or early 70s, everybody has things that are like starting to creak and not work as well or whatever, and needing surgeries. The surgery that you referred to that I had was because I was such a heavy duty gardener. I had to have shoulder surgery because I tore a tendon. And now I get more help. I still garden, but the heavy stuff like that, somebody else does it. I'd rather pay someone and I can. That's a fortunate thing that I can pay for extra help. Not everyone can. So.
Yeah, when you said that, it reminded me, I had to take my mom to the emergency room this year, Francine. Not for anything, thankfully, serious, but she was potting plants, and I had been on her, don't have those hanging plants where it's a problem. She was hanging some plants, popped her shoulder out of the joint, had to take it to the emergency room and get her the cortisone shots and all of that. And I was like, and the doctor was like, well, what were you doing? And she looked at me. and she, he had to, he said to her, well, maybe you shouldn't be doing that anymore, So it is one of those things, right? We all have to deal with them. I want to say to go back to A Wolf in the Family, because as you did something very personal in this book. I didn't expect it. You allowed us to see pictures of your family. What was that like for you to go through the pictures?
Oh, that just happened recently. It was this past January. My niece ran across a box of photos that she had inherited from her mother, my sister.
Mm-hmm.
And she said, I've got this box of photos and I don't know who any of these people are. Do you want to look through them? And I had already, the book was pretty much turned in and everything. I was pretty far along with it. And I'm like, my gosh, look at this. Here's my grandmother. Here's my step grandfather. Here's their daughter, who was my aunt, who I never knew. She died before I knew her too. And there was a picture of the kids that were taken to the orphanage, including my Uncle Frank, who couldn't be admitted because he was 14. And I thought, I'm sticking these in this book somehow. And I had thought about doing a reader's guide for book clubs, because I think this is a really good book club book. It really lends itself to discussion about the kinds of things that went on then and have they changed or have they not changed today. And so I thought, I'd like to put these in here and let people see who these real people were. And they were just treasures to find those photos. It was wonderful. Yeah. Lucky.
Yeah, after reading the book to actually see the photos, it was like, wow, this is really something. I mean, to be able to think about. I want to talk about just for a moment about Naomi, and I think there's no way, even as people are reading the book, and again, for those who are coming in late, it is historical fiction, so Francine was able to take some license here. It's not saying that, of course, regardless of what time, she realized she had made some mistakes. But it was, I think, the cost that was put on her for those mistakes, just because of, for one, her being who she was, but also what she had done, and the way it was looked at, I think says so much, I think, for people, Francine, as they're looking at themselves and thinking about the idea of forgiveness, the idea of being able to move on, how definitely there's no one who would say that Frank, I mean, and like I said, you were able to use some licenses here, was a good person that had good motives. I'll put it that way. What was that like for you to think about, though, that the role of power in all of this? Because that's what I kept thinking about. A lot of this has to do with power. Who is given power, who is seen with power, and what happens to those who don't have it.
I was surprised that my grandfather was able to do what he did. And as we've discussed, this is historical fiction. So I knew some of the facts, and I don't know if I got it all right, okay, but it appears that he put them in the orphanage against my grandmother's will. And I don't know that for sure, but just the fact that he could do that, I looked for any kind of papers showing that there was a divorce before that happened, and I could not find anything about that. And usually you can find that kind of stuff online, right, in genealogical records or whatever. And right, and I assumed they had been divorced, but I don't think they were at the time when he took the children to the orphanage. That was, and my understanding is that he did that for selfish purposes, which people will read about in the book. I was surprised at that too. Yeah. It was shocking when I first learned. But as I say, I knew my grandfather, and he did not seem like a sweet, compassionate, affectionate person. I don't remember him ever putting an arm around me or anything like that. And I wondered too, in the process of writing this, if that was partly because he didn't like it that I had a disability. I know my mother was ashamed of my disability. She didn't say it, but she kind of showed me in some ways. So he may have thought that I was inferior. I don't think he related to children that well, to tell you the truth. And I know that some of the children sided with him because they disapproved of what their mother had done that caused him to it didn't directly cause him to put the kids in the orphanage,
Mm-hmm.
but that was the decision that he made after some other things happened that he thought was the right thing to do, which is amazing to me. And with regard to power, yes, I mean, today there would have been a custody battle, and I don't know that they would have had the money for that.
Mm-hmm.
But at that time, men kind of treated their wives and their children as chattel. Men more or less own their kids. And today it's a little better. It still happens, but at least women and children have some legal rights today.
Yeah. Francine, it's a great book, and I'm so glad to catch up with you again. We're 3 for 3 now. I've interviewed you with all 3 of the books. So definitely, if you guys have not read Francine's story, I invite you to read Not a Poster Child. It's here on Amazon. You can get it there in paperback and Kindle. No Spring Chicken, but her newest book is A Wolf in the Family. It's available now. You can maybe get your own copy here on Amazon. Francine, let our audience know how they can stay connected with you.
Excuse me?
Let our audience know how they can stay connected with you.
Oh, well, I have a website, FrancineFalk-Allen.com, and I'm on Facebook quite often, and that's Facebook at Francine Falk-Allen author. And there, I don't know that the hyphen is in there, but my website and Facebook are the best places to reach me, or keep up with me, whatever you want to call it. I am on Instagram, but I'm kind of a klutz with Instagram. I'm not very good with it yet. So
I understand. Francine, thank you again. Congratulations. I'm looking forward to our next conversation together.
Well, thank you so much, Cyrus. I really appreciate the opportunity, and it's always fun to talk with you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And we thank you, our audience, for tuning in to another great segment of Cyrus Webb Presents. Until next time, you all make it a great one. We'll talk to you soon. Take care.